now, quite a lot of time. And one of the go-to guy for me, as well as I think a lot of other people, when it comes to anything growth. Okay, he has built a whole bunch of companies. He sits on a bunch of, on the board of a lot of companies. Some of the names you're already aware of: Tala, Zoomcar, and so on. And today he's going to cover scaling and growth for all of us. It's not going to be the usual lecture-based session today. We're going to be more of a conversation and certain topics. Nishkam will open up a whiteboard and then explain things. Right, so it's going to be much more interactive than the other sessions, which are largely lecture-based, because there's so much of stuff to cover just in scaling and growth. You can practically have another 9-week course on this. It's that huge, right? Okay, so Nishkam, without spending any more minute, thank you so much for waking up.
Of course.
And
all right.
So I have. Okay, somebody wants to know, is that a Twitch sweatshirt? Okay, out of the scope of this. Out of the scope of this.
No, but it's a company called 2BT, but close, yeah.
Yes. Okay. So Nishkant, just to give you a quick sense of what we are doing here. Essentially, this is a bunch of strangers who have come together to learn about product, especially in the current scenario where things are pretty uncertain overall in product and growth, and with the intent that they will be better prepared for the upcoming interviews and stuff. There are a lot of layoffs happening. There are a lot of, things are not so rosy at the moment. So, best time to actually strengthen up their product career. So that's the kind of group that you're talking about. There are a lot of beginners, and then there are a lot of advanced people. In general, we don't cover basic topics. Basic topics, there's a lot of literature available online, so people can easily refer. The keywords and the terms are easy to find out. People can simply learn. So you can assume that people already are aware of what is virality coefficient, and they're already aware of those basics. You don't have to go into that. We'll directly start with a certain intermediate advanced level. Okay. So I have a bunch of questions, and
sure.
Whenever you feel like it's best explained via whiteboard, please go ahead. Okay. So my first question here is, till the last session, I covered right from product strategy all the way to artifacts like creating the journey maps, creating the PRDs, creating all of that stuff. And now a typical PM has defined the strategy, has defined what is to be built, and has defined the development roadmap, etc. All of that is done. And now he's figuring out, okay, now how do I take this to the market? And in fact, that has also been covered. How to, what's the go-to market and what's the pricing strategy? All of that is done now. So now the question is, how do you think about scaling and growth? Fundamentally, what's the difference between scaling and growth? If you can start from that itself, what's the difference between scaling and growth?
Sure. So I guess that the way that I see it is, there's right. I guess that the way that I would say that growth is right. I think that I would call it kind of like a discipline, right? And I think that there is like a bunch of different things which you do within it, right? And so when you look at your growth stack per se, right? I think you're looking at growth as a driver that is coming in either from acquisition initiatives. You could have growth coming in from things that you're doing on the retention end. You could have growth that is coming in, from like the partnership side, right? And so I think that is one way that I look at that. Then, right, I think there's a flip side of it is, for all the growth initiatives that we are doing, like we're ultimately doing it to scale, right? And so I think that like the one thing that I love to share from my whiteboard is exactly, like what are things I mean by that? Hey, Talvinder, can you give me access to my whiteboard? It's an account called the Nishkam whiteboard.
Yes, I've given you the access. And and Nishkam, perhaps you can switch off your video because a lot of people don't have very good bandwidths. Sometimes it gets choked.
Sure. Okay. So I guess there's this question that I look at, which is when, and I hope that like my handwriting isn't too bad, but a business scale, right?
Correct. When does the business scale? When does the business grow?
And so the one thing, which you all, right, I think look at is what does a retention curve look like, right? And so let's say, there is a 1st of Jan today. And right, I think just an oversimplified example. And then you've got this notion of how many percentage of customers are coming back, right? And so most businesses will typically follow some kind of like a retention curve, right? Which will say that you start off with 100% of your customers, and then come, like a month out, call it D30, right? So that's like the end of, so Jan 30th, for example, right? And then come on this particular date, you've got X number of customers left. And so just call it close to 50%, right? And so to me, the point at which a business truly scales is when your retention curve flatlines, right? Which is, here's a journey of the company starting from the top. Here's how many 100 customers you got. And then when you get to this 50, where it flatlines, right? This is where the business truly scales up. And so if you're doing user acquisition against it, right? And I'm just trying to think, let's just call it like a double axis over here, right? And then call this user acquisition. Then basically what's going to happen is, you start spending, right, like your rupees, and then you start truly scaling up once your retention flatline, because that's where you're compounding users. And so I think that's like the biggest framework that I've seen, just like a mental model between, here's my growth discipline. So here are all the different strategies and the toolkits which I have, when it's looking at how do I drive growth, right? And then you could argue that these are the early stages of your growth as a business, right? Where you're understanding, you're figuring things out. But once you flatline from a retention perspective, that's where you're now building, right, like the actual user base and starting to do the compounding of all the users that you get. So I think that's just like a quick, like a mental model that I use. Do you think that speaks to like the question that you'd asked? There?
Sorry. Yeah, I was on mute. Absolutely, I think this makes a lot of sense in terms of So people typically think of scaling and growth as the same thing, while it's not exactly the same thing. Scaling is very different and growth is very different. So I think this addresses, and there's a follow-up question to this, which is now this retention curve is something that usually you see in a B2C company, right? In a B2C use case. How does this, right. How does this different, like how is this applicable for a B2B scenario?
Sure, right. And I think, yeah, right. I guess, let's just take like an example, right? I think, that like the most common example is actually Dropbox and Box. So I guess, that like those of you, that don't know, right? And so Dropbox is like a cloud storage company. You can go online and then start to upload. Yeah, right. I think, just like the local, right, the files and folders, right? And so your Dropbox, which started off with like a very B2C focus, right? And so I guess what they were known for, yeah, right. I guess that was just like the referral chat, which is for every friend you invite, you get like a few hundred MB or GB of storage for free. The other contrast to that, right? And I think this goes to like the B2B example is actually Box. And so what Box did is that they started to go to the end users at companies, right? And then from the ground up at those companies, build interest, build their base, and then would go to the top of the IT department and say, hey, you know what, it turns out that a vast majority of employees currently use me, right? And so please switch over from whatever cloud storage you have, and so now come switch over to me, right? So that's what they did. Now, what they did really well, right? And I think this framework in some ways still holds, is if from like an ARR perspective, if you find that my early users within a B2B setting, if they're continuing to find value, and the point at which they say, yes, yeah, right, I think that I want to go for like a renewal or, come stick with you, that's when you effectively quote unquote flatline, right? And so as a VC or anybody else looking at this, I think that is a metric, which I think should matter, which is, what is your repeat usage within your B2B company, right? And frankly, that is no different than this inflection point over here where you are truly flatlining. Does that make
Understood.
sense?
Understood. So essentially, you're saying that this is this retention curve and this flatline flatlining of retention curve is common across B2B, B2C scenarios. What matters rather is, what matters rather here is how clearly are you articulating the metric that you're going to track.
Yes.
Perfect. Okay. Quick question, quick follow-up question to this. So when is scaling the preferred strategy and when growth is preferred strategy? When do you define that, okay, now it's time to scale? And when do you say that, let's say, now it's time to grow, or you do both the things all the time?
Yeah, right. And I think, we typically kind of see it, that it's like a zigzag, but at the same time, right? I think that like the key indicators that tell me, that like a business is now beyond the kind of initial growth spurt phases, but now it is truly ready to scale. So the first thing is, just like the retention curve, right? I think, that if you do see that flatlining, then I think that's like, then that is one key criteria. And so I think, let me see if I can write here. Key indicators. So the one is the retention curve, right? So retention curve flatlines. The other that I look at it is, just like the unit economics, right? And so what is your ratio of LTV to CAC?
Okay.
Sorry, CAC to LTV, right? And the thing that I also mean by this, though, right? I think, there's like a lot of the consumers, or right? I guess there's like a lot of the like your consumer startups, which might look at the unit economics or CAC based on just like an app open, or just like a cost per install, right? And so I think that's where you really need to go. Yeah, right. I guess that I would say that like a down funnel kind of exercise, right? So it's not just about and let's take streaming video, since that's my background. Right? You look at your CAC as like somebody who's installed the app, or you look at your CAC for somebody who's actually subscribed to Hulu. And so there, right, I think that like the key becomes for us to look at what is your cost per subscription, because that is ultimately when you make money, right? And so both for the retention curve and for right like the CAC, look at it from a unit economics perspective. That is one. Then the third thing, if you happen to be like in a social sharing app, is questions around, what's like the virality that you have.
Got it.
So I think these things matter just as a signal in just in terms of how actively are these guys actually engaging with you. So I guess, these are broadly, right, like the three indicators that capture what is the health of your business and whether you're ready to scale up.
Understood. So there are three things to bother. One is the retention after D30, let's say. And I suppose D30 is just an indicator, right? So D30 might be very well be D60 depending on the use case of your business.
Correct.
Right. So D30 or D60, whatever is the typical expectation of a churn. Based on that, you can come up with, come up with the retention at that time. That's number one. Number two is the unit economics, which is CAC over LTV. And finally, the virality of your entire solution. Awesome. Here's my question. So in your example, you have mentioned 50% as a good point, right? Like 50% as a point at which it's flatlining, for example. Is there a number, is there a benchmark that you look at that if it is less than 9%, less than 5%, for example, then there's a fundamental issue with the product itself, that it is, it is leaking badly. So we need to fix the product first before you even grow or do any effort in growing.
Yeah, totally, right. And in some ways, though, right, I think this is just kind of like a mathematical exercise, right? And I think that is going to change from like the one industry to the next. But at the same time, though, right, I think that like the mental model that I use is right. I think that if at least half of your customers are coming back 1 month after they've initially subscribed or done a purchase action or something else with you, then that's a good sign, that they are finding value with you. So I think that is roughly kind of like the guideline that I use. The other thing which I use, right? But I think this can also just be on like some certain specialized cases, right? So an example is, that like the mobile gaming industry, right? I think, that like the shelf life of a game is basically a month, right? And so
Right.
that's where it's not just about what is your D30 retention alone, but it's also about like the D0 conversion, because I think that is a strong sign of intent. And so what I mean by
Understood.
that is, that if you got like a consumer who installed the app and then on the very first day they convert, then I think that tells me, that like the customer is actually finding strong value. But I would say, that's not like the norm though, right? I think, that like a rough guideline that I use is just like the D30 conversion. Um, I'm sorry, what's your retention look like on D30?
Understood. Understood. And just to, because a lot of people are asking about B2B versus B2C again and again.
Yeah.
So just to confirm, so these three metrics, these three indicators, retention at D30, for example, retention at D30, unit economics, that is CAC over LTV, and virality. Is this common across B2B and B2C, or are there special indicators, or there are some other indicators that you would look at for a B2B company? Let's define B2B company as well. So B2B company can be a SaaS company, for example, or it could be a typical enterprise company like Box, for example, today, which essentially
Right.
sells long-term contracts to large enterprises, or Salesforce, for example, right? So how would Salesforce growth strategy differ from, let's say, uh, I don't know, Dropbox strategy?
Or sure. So I guess, that like the virality is not going to be as key for, just like the Salesforce, for example, right? I think, for them, what matters isn't so much, yeah, right. I guess, what's like the K factor, because that's going to be like a bit jumbled, but for them, what's going to matter is,
So,
right, I think
sorry,
just like the ARR.
Nishkam,
Hi, can you
sorry,
hear me?
I'm just jumping
Yeah,
in. Sorry,
yeah.
is Nishkam clear? Is his voice clear for everyone? I'm getting a lot of, okay, can be better.
Okay,
No, not really. So
I'm
there's some
seeing a
amount of
bunch of
network
no's.
issue, I think, at your end.
All right, let me see what I can do. I don't really know what I can fix, but just give me 1 sec.
Sure. Yeah, it could be the Bluetooth headphone also. It could be because of that.
Hey, so is this any better?
Oh, wow. So much better.
Really? Okay. So I guess it was my Bluetooth.
Yeah. Okay. Awesome. So the question here was Salesforce versus, let's say, Dropbox. How would things differ for a B2B versus B2C setup? Because I think that's the fundamental point at which people are differing or not able to understand.
Sure. So I guess, that it's not that much about like right? I guess, just like the virality that matters to a company like Box, right? Which is more like the B2B end, or, just like a Salesforce, right? And so I think, what matters for them is getting indicators around just like the recurring usage, right? It's like the one stat which you might have heard, that like the VCs speak about quite often is, things, yeah, right. I think that's like the monthly recurring revenue. What is the annual recurring revenue? And so I think those are the metrics which then matter quite a bit. And so I would say over here for B2B specifically, I would say things like what is the MRR and what is the ARR, right? And so I think the more signals that you have around that, so I guess, that those matter.
Got it. Got it. And for B2B, typically virality will not matter too much unless, Slack was one of the anomalies to that. I think Slack benefited from virality.
Right.
Right. But I think most startups would not, or most products will not enjoy that kind of inherent virality, I suppose. Right.
Yeah, totally. Right. I think, that is going to be different, from like the one company to the next. But at the same time, though, right, I think, that like the mental model is the same, right? I think that like the more that you can prove that the existing customers see value from the
Right.
particular thing, I think, that like the more it'll speak to you that this business is ready for scaling up now.
Understood. So if I were to summarize for everyone, essentially there's B2B and B2C. Retention and unit economics is, I think, common across B2C and B2B. You have to bother about retention as well as unit economics in both the cases, irrespective.
Correct.
In B2C, pure consumer startups, you would look at virality for sure, because it's the only way to actually grow your customer base without spending a ton of money. And if you're a B2B, you will definitely look at your MRR and ARR, because that's what you're pushing for. That's what you're growing for. Without that, you're dead in the sea immediately.
Correct.
Right. Okay. This is solid. Uh, the next is, fine. So we have some idea of, okay. So all the questions, all the people who are asking about virality and etc., we will be covering that slightly later. We will be covering that. Just hold on to your horses. So next question is, so we have this foundation or basics in place. There's retention curve that one needs to look at. There are some indicators one has to look at. The question is, how do you put all of this together for a young startup, or let's say young startup versus a Series A startup? If you walk into, let's say, I don't know, some young startup today, how would you put a growth strategy around them? What should they be looking? What will be your day 1, day 2, day 3 things that you'll be looking at? Then what will be the kind of dashboard that you build? And then what will you start tracking for a young startup in a B2C setup?
Sure. And so I think, let's talk about that on like the next page, right? And so the way that I see it is, that like the early indicators that you see, I guess, that's going to change based on like, what is the maturity of the product and business.
Right.
But at the same time, though, right, I think, there's also like the same way to actually look at, what's happening to like, to like the actual product and customer journey. And so the thing that I mean by that is, right, I think, that the earlier that you are, the odds are, that like your product is early, which
Right.
means, that like the customer experience is also early. And so it's fine for you to focus, just on like the early customer, like life cycle there. And so I think, that like, that like the first comment that or I guess like the first question which I'll ask to any early stage company is, yeah, right, I guess, what's like the D0 conversion? Because I think that is the single most impactful metric when it comes to, how much value our customers seeing from the product, right? And then I think the more you evolve, that's where, yeah, right, I think it's also going to become clear to the customer, become clear to you as like a product owner, as a business, and to the VC about how much value that these customers, will see in you, and what does the retention look like. And so the way that I would say is, just one is focus on the early customer journey.
So if you're typing something, we are not seeing anything at the moment.
Yeah, I'm trying to figure out. I can't draw on my iPad anymore for some reason. But I would say, that's like the first thing that actually matters to me, for any early company is, what does the early customer journey look like for these
So that
consumers?
is, so basically the day 0 conversion is what you're talking about, correct?
Correct. Yeah.
How is that performing? If that itself is not good, then there's no point of optimizing anything later on.
Yeah, totally. Because I think, that if they're not actually converting that well just on the first day, then the odds are, that they're not going to come back the next day. And so if you don't have like the D0 conversion, then like the D1, like the retention is not going to be there, right? And if it's not happening on D1, the odds are, that it's not going to happen onto like D30.
Yeah. Got it. So can you take an example of, let's say, some startup that you can think of right now?
Yeah.
For example, let's say for Instagram, right? Let's take an example of Instagram. So when we say day 0, D0 conversion, what will D0 conversion look like for Instagram?
Sure. And so I think, that's where though, right? I would say, right, I guess, let's actually draw like a distinction, between businesses that are free compared, to actually businesses that are paid, or,
Right.
Just like the businesses, that are on the web versus on the app. And so I think, that the fundamentalist way to answer that question is whether it's Instagram, which is free effectively, or whether it's something like, Dropbox, which is, or I guess it's freemium, or something like Netflix, where you have to pay.
Right.
And so I guess that like the D0 conversion for Instagram would be a user who has actually come onto the platform and who has invited friends. because I think that's like the ultimate currency, just for right for any content, for any virality, right?
Right.
And so I think that like lowest common right like a denominator for them is how many friends do you have within your first week of joining. And so I think from that standpoint, if you've got friends on the very first day that you've added because you've joined Instagram, that to me tells me that like the D0 conversion for them is good.
Got it. So essentially, you have defined some success metric, which is, for example, for a free app like Instagram, would be how many other people have you connected with, or how many people have you followed in Instagram. That will be perhaps a metric, right?
Correct.
How many people have you followed? And if you're following enough people on the first day itself, then then the D0 conversion is there. So conversion is measured by the number of people you're following, correct?
Correct.
Versus on Netflix, how would you look at that?
Yeah, so I think that like a Netflix case is actually quite straightforward, right? I think that it's like the D0 conversion of a consumer that comes in, and the fact is, right, I guess that they actually took like a free trial, so they put down right like their credit card, and then right, I guess that if they hit play on a video, because that tells me that this consumer is now converted from being somebody who had just opened the app or opened the website, but is not actually transacting with you. And so I think, right. I guess that comes down to like a value exchange, right? And so if you've got proof points of value, which you're giving to the end consumer, that to me is like a strong kind of like an indicator of the D0 conversion.
Very interesting. I think that's something that I would like to pause and would like to highlight once again. So D0 conversion should be measured in terms of the value that you're providing to the end user. So having a good grip on what's the value of your app or for your product will help you in identifying whether your product is making sense or not. Or that could be used as a metric as well. So in Instagram, the value is perhaps the people that you can follow. And that's why the number of people you're following on D0, or if at all you're following somebody on D0, is a measure of conversion. While in Netflix, the value that you're providing effectively is the movies that you're watching. So even if you put the credit card in, but if you're not watching anything, then there's a good chance that you'll be dropping off and the retention will be zero. Is that a right summary, Nishkant?
Yeah, absolutely. Right. I think that's like the right way to look at it.
Perfect. Okay, so the next question around this is, there's all talks about virality, funnels and this and that. I believe a better way to look at growth in the modern ecosystem is actually not in terms of funnels, but in terms of flywheels and loops.
Correct.
Right? Funnels are more suitable for, let's say, a B2B construct, where where you're selling something and ultimately somebody buys it, and that's it, everything is done. Versus flywheels and growth loops or viral loops are the one which are much more connected or much more relevant for a consumer or a modern way of looking at products, whether B2B or B2C.
Correct.
Right. So can you give an example of, let's say, is your whiteboard and everything working now?
Yeah, it is. And
awesome.
So I guess that like the most common example, right? And I think I'll just take kind of like a B2B2C example, right? And so let's just look at Slack, for example, right? And so I think
sure.
that you all know about Slack. So it's like an enterprise, like a messaging app, right?
Right.
And so if you look at the loop for Slack, right? And basically what they're saying is that when a user joins, he or she, they will drive like an invitation to a bunch of friends, right? And so let's just call it that like the colleagues join.
Right.
Right. So colleagues join. I think that I'm actually spelling it wrong. And then once the colleagues join, they in turn will invite more of their other colleagues. And then I think that like the loop continues, right? So I think this is just like a very oversimplified example, but I think it helps to illustrate this point, right? And so here's like a very high level growth loop for Slack. What's basically happening is that if you start off with 100 users and then they each would invite 10, right? So that's like 1,000, and then from those 1,000, let's say that close to right, I think that's like the 10% accept, and so that's like another 10, right? And so then these 10 will then add up, and this number becomes 110, right? I mean, I think that, sorry, yeah, right. And I think that is kind of like the way that like the loop basically compounds up. And so the way that I would quantify that, right? And I don't think this is kind of like a rocket science thing, is just go across each step. So I'll call it step, right? And so call it like the cycle 0 or like step 1, step 2, step 3, keep going down all the way, to like, say 100, for example, right? And so I think, this is commonly done into like an Excel spreadsheet or Google Sheets, whatever that you use, right? And then what you want to start off with is, just like the base of the users that you have, right? And so let's say, that I've got like 100 users at base 0. And then I look at how many invitations per user has been sent out. So let's say, that like the first batch of the users that invite, that number happens to be 10, right? And then what is the acceptance, right? So of the 10 who've been invited per user, what is the acceptance, right? Like the percentage, right? So acceptance percentage, I'll call it over there. And then I'll just say, what are the net new users you've gotten from this, right? And so that's this column over here. And so let's, right, I guess, let's assume that for every 100 users, they're each inviting, that's like the 10 users, yeah, right? So it's like the 10 invites per user, right? And let's say the acceptance of that happens to be 10%. And so this tells me, that like a total of 1,000 invites have been sent, right? Because it's like the 100 times 10. And then the acceptance of that is actually 10%. And this equals to how many new users have you driven in? So that's 10. So now your base goes up, by right, like 10. So now you've got 110 users, and then those 10 will then have invited like another 10, right? And so then this cycle continues. And then the number that you're left with at the end of this, that is basically, your growth loop model, right? And so I think it's like a very high level oversimplification, but that's the way that the math works.
Got it. Got it. And I believe there are plenty of examples, plenty of formulas and mathematical formulas that you can actually just put in the numbers. You can get those numbers out. But I'll just go deeper in this, this example. So Slack is one. Can you give a similar example of, let's say, so invites per user is something that works very well for startups like or products like Slack, right? But then there are products like Salesforce or let's say WebEngage or CleverTap or Amplitude, for example. Right? Where, or SaaS companies in general, where there is no concept per se of, let's say, inviting users.
Right.
Right. So how would virality work in those cases?
Sure. Right. And so I think, that like the way that I would quantify that though, right? I think, that it's about like the density of the user base that matters. Right. And I think, that there's a comment that just came in and I think that I do agree that, that was a mistake that I made in like my modeling. So it needs to be, just like the net new users that you got from that. So that is
right. Right. The base will improve. Yes.
Yeah. Okay. So I guess, just back to the other question that you had, right? And I guess, that, for companies which don't inherently have like an invitation or like a referral loop, what happens, right? And so there, it's not just about how many or of like, your CleverTap users invite the other CleverTap users, but it's about what is that density you have just inside of that one company, right? And it's like, let's say it's that you work for, yeah, right. I think let's just call it like a Microsoft, right? And so how many employees within the Microsoft currently use your product, right? And so the odds are that like the vast majority of them use it. That tells me, that this product has gone quote unquote viral at Microsoft. And this is what Box did exceptionally well, right? So the way, that Box grew was, instead of them going, yeah, right, I guess, just to the top, to like your chief IT procurement guy, what they would do is build a user base from the ground up, right? And so once they got to that point where the vast majority of the company was actually using Box, that's when, right? And I guess, that they would go to, whoever the head of IT was and say, actually, guys, you know what, like your company already uses Box, right? And so now please get into like an enterprise contract with me, for like the next few years. So I think that is right, like the mental model, that I would say is, what is your density within that network?
Understood. So can you, so on the same thread, because this is something that a lot of people ask me and there's a lot of doubts about, how to measure this. And most people immediately, relegate these concepts of growth to B2C companies like Instagram and Facebook and others, while these fundamentals are common or can be applied in pretty much in all constructs. So let's pick up Hotstar, for example.
Sure.
right? So how would you define, or how would you think Hotstar can invoke these concepts and, implement virality, or how would you come up with, let's say, viral growth strategy for Hotstar? They have some very interesting content, yes, but that's pretty much Hotstar bombarding everybody that, hey, I have pretty amazing content. How can, let's say, a user to user network effect grow for Hotstar like a company?
Yeah, right. And I guess there's kind of like the two different questions, right? I think there's like the network effect, which is what happens once you get to scale, both within your user base and otherwise.
Right.
And then I think there's like the virality, which is to say, that if I have one user, like, would that one user inherently need to invite a few others to have a better experience, or would that user see value in inviting other people
Got
onto
it.
that platform to actually watch together? And so I guess that like an example, and I'll just draw like a very broad like matrix, right? And I would say let's call this network effects, and let's call this virality. And so an example of like a virality could be co-viewing, right? So just the idea, that I can actually watch a show with like 6 of my friends.
Oh,
And so if you
nice.
call it just like the virtual couch, right? And so if you're all like watching a cricket match together, that is one. The effect of, or yeah, I think that like an example of like a network effect is, that I would say, getting a contract for like the next IPL, right?
Right.
Where what they need to show is, what we as Hotstar currently have got a few 100 million streams that are happening on like a monthly active basis, right? And so I think
Right.
that is one. The other thing that I would say, from like a virality standpoint, is just getting sharing, right? So how do you get consumers of Hotstar to actually share what you're watching? And so the one thing that I've seen just from like the streaming video world is actually consumers that they don't want to share that they're watching, yeah, right. I guess that like the next episode of Kim Kardashian, right? And so to actually get consumers to share is really hard, right? And so just the idea that you can even get the consumers to share what they're watching and use that as a way to invite other people. So I think that is also key, right? And so I think, well, hang on. So I think that's something that I would say, would be an example of virality. The network effect, on the other hand, would be, just in terms of the content viewing.
Okay.
And I think, this is kind of like a byproduct of this, right? And so it's saying for all the content that we have, or for all the content that has been shared, how much of this can be attributed, to my network, right? Or like my network talking about it. And so if you've seen, content, let's not call it viewing, let's call it trending,
Okay.
right? So I think that's like an example of a network effect. Yeah, right. I think that I can keep going, uh, but I think you guys actually get the difference between these two, right?
Understood. Yeah. So
Yeah.
virality versus network versus, I think I'm getting the hang of it. So virality is much more about building up features which can enable people to share more, or connect with more people, versus network effects is much more about um, after the virality, or after the enough density or enough people are using that feature, for example, what is the outcome of that?
Yeah, so I think yeah, right. I guess that like a mental model that I use is that like the virality speaks to just like a consumer, right? And so I think this
Uh-huh.
goes down to like the unit, right? And
Uh-huh.
says that for this one individual customer that I have, what is that value that they're seeing from, or I guess what are values and behaviors which they're seeing to invite other people onto the platform. And so I think, just try to think of it as like the coronavirus, for like a lack of a better example, right? And
Right.
so what is that spread from that one individual? So I
Right.
think that is one key construct. And then what you're looking at a network effect is now, and so again, back to that coronavirus analogy, what's happening to my state of like Delhi, for example, right? And then, and how many users within Delhi have got coronavirus, right?
Got
And
it.
so now looking at that as a framework to understand it, right? And so your network effects are inherently more at a macro level, which is saying,
Understood.
what, yeah, right. I guess, that like the schools and colleges that you have, how many users are on Facebook, right? And then whereas virality is of the one, right, like the user that I have on this campus, right, is he on Facebook or Instagram? That kind
Wow.
of thing.
I think that's a fantastic like explanation between virality versus network effects, and I think that kind of explains a lot of the confusion that people typically have. So virality is largely seen from the lens of a single user, single unit, versus network effects is seen from the mass, that in the larger set of users, whether it's a state, whether it's a geography, whether it's a college, whether it's a company, for example,
Correct.
right? How exactly is my product floating within that environment? How many people out of this entire state of Delhi, for example, are using a particular product, for instance, right?
Yes. Yeah.
Pretty awesome. Okay, so we have a lot of questions asked in the chat, and I just have one more question, and then we will open it up for Q&A. So the one question is essentially, so all of this requires a lot of instrumentation. It requires a lot of data gathering, analytics, and so on and so forth, right? So essentially, my last question is composed of two sub-questions. Question number one is, how do you measure and how frequently do you measure? So all of this information, how do you instrument it? So like I said, a young startup, you enter a young startup or a young product, for example, within a large company. Now, how do you define what should be instrumented, what should be, how should analytics be instrumented in the first place, number one, and how much of it should be instrumented before the launching the product, number one, and number two, how frequently will you measure? Will you measure like once? I mean, obviously the data is coming every day, every single second, but will you be checking the data every day, or will you be checking every week, or how is it going to be?
Yeah, totally, right. And so I think that like the short answer is, right, I guess that you actually go to like the data like very often, right? And so if you're like a young startup, right, I think what you want to instrument, right, and so this speaks to the what do you track, then I think there's the how often do you track it.
Okay.
Right? And so like what you track is that I would say let's look at things that's like the D0 conversion, because that's just your early life cycle. And so if you can actually nail that, then I think that tells me that you've got like some value exchange which is happening, right? And then the next question is it frequently happening, right? Like this exchange of value between you and the end consumer. And so that's where I think looking at that retention curve matters quite a bit, right? And so now looking at what is my D1 retention, which is immediately after D0. Right? And so for anybody who you've converted on their very first day, what's the odds that they come back the next day, right? And so really focusing in within their first week and first month. And so I think that's the way that I would kind of frame it to like a young startup is, right. I think that if you can accurately to like a strong confidence model out what is happening within the early life cycle of your customer, first day, first week, first month.
Right.
Then I think right. I guess that's like a great starting point, right? And so that is now in terms of what you measure. Then the next thing is how often do you track, right? And so I would say at least close to like a multiple times a day, right? And so that's like the D0 conversion, for example. I think that like the retention starts, will obviously not happen on like on like a few hours. It's not going to change, right? And so I think that's where looking at your retention once every couple of days, understanding what's like right, I guess just like the rolling retention, but also what is my right, I guess just like the calendar week, right? And so what I mean by that is that instead of looking at things from Sunday to Saturday, or from Monday to Sunday, looking at what's my rolling 7-day retention, because I think that's where you can catch like a few trends a bit sooner than waiting for like the weekly cohort to actually complete.
Correct.
And so that's what I would say is, look at like the rolling retention, maybe once every 2-3 days, and then look at, just like the calendar retention once every week, right? And just understand how are your cohorts behaving.
Got it.
And so that's kind of like a high level of, of like how often would you look at it.
Understood. Understood. Now that is very valuable. Maybe we can touch upon this once again just on this session. I think there's a lot of stuff to cover in this. So just a follow-up question to this answer. What are your typical tools that you use? Like, do you use Google Analytics? Is that sufficient, or do you suggest some other tools?
Yeah, so the way that I actually answer that question is, right, I guess, there's like a lot of different tools, that are great at like a bunch of different things. And so if you look at tools, that's like a Clever Tap, right? I think, they're great at it, from like the perspective of what's happening with my engagement or my CRM,
Right.
There's tools, there's like a mixed panel or, like the amplitude that you mentioned, which will look at what's happening at a product analytics level.
Right.
And so that's kind of like a deeper chat as well. But like, I think that, that like a key framework there is you should be able to, go to the granularity of this consumer came from this kind of like an ad set on Facebook, right? So it's not even, this consumer came from this campaign on Facebook, but
Right.
within that campaign, here's a creative that drove this consumer, and then this consumer then came back like a week after at this like retention rate. Like if you can define that journey where you're not tying in what's happening at acquisition, you're tying in what's happening at product analytics. So once they get into the funnel, start using the app, and then if you can tie it to engagement, which is here's what they did when they got their first push notification, then I would say, yeah, right. I think excuse me, that like the analytics stack for you is optimized, right? And
Got it.
and, and so there, whether it is mixed panel, whether it's amplitude, whether it's clever tap, or have you, just know that you need to be able to tie that entire customer journey together in one view.
So, okay, out of these tools, which one would you recommend for a newbie who's just getting into growth and stuff? So what's a good starting point? Which tool should the person start?
Yeah, so I think, that actually Google Analytics is good if you've got like a web product. And
Okay.
if you've got like a mobile app product, then I would say something, that's like like GA is good, but I think in my personal opinion, what I prefer is a tool which is either like mixed panel, amplitude, or Localytics. And so I know, that actually all those three tools have got what's known as their scholarship programs. And so you basically go to their site and say, that you're like an early stage company. And then I think, that there's some preferential pricing, which they give you. Right. And I think, from like an acquisition standpoint, so I think, that I tend to like this company called AppsFlyer.
Okay.
Right. And so I think they're good from an acquisition analytics perspective, which is, this campaign on Facebook drove these many installs for you, for example, right? And so that's one tool that I would recommend. Just because I guess, that like the way that they charge is just on the paid installs. So if you've got organic installs, that's free. And then from an engagement standpoint, right, I think, that's where there's like a bunch of different companies. There's companies like CleverTap, there's also WebEngage, for example. So if you're right, I guess, if it's like an India product, then I think, both these companies have got like localized knowledge on how do you ensure, that like a push notification actually goes to that end consumer. And if you've got a global product, that I would say companies, that could be like Lean Plum or Braze are good when it comes to the engagement side of the story.
Understood. So basically, in the entire journey, right from the acquisition till the maybe retention and everything, there are different tools. So there's not a single tool, so to say, which takes care of the entire journey. So you can't simply install one. You can't simply set up one analytics tool and you can say that I'm good to go. You need to look at acquisition. For that, you are recommending AppsFlyer. If you're looking for engagement and improving your engagement and so on with the customers, with the users, then CleverTap, WebEngage are decent. And if you're looking at product analytics as to what are the things that your product is doing wrong, or what are the areas, opportunities that your product is presenting, then mixed panel or amplitude or Localytics, all three are good.
Correct. Yeah.
Correct. So these are three different broad use cases for three different products.
Correct.
Awesome. This was meaningful. So I'm going to open up the session for everybody to ask questions, and already a bunch of questions have been asked. So there's AppsFlyer is for acquisition analytics. So there are of them. So there was one by Nitin. Just give me a second.
We just lost you, Talvinder.
Sorry. Am I audible now?
A little bit.
Yeah. Okay. So there's one question by Swapnil, which is, how should growth product manager align between tech and marketing? Where does he lie? And who does he, report to, so to say?
Yeah, that's a great question, right? And I think, that, yeah, right. I guess that like the way that I would actually answer that question is, based right? I think that like the way that you grow, right? And so if like the differentiator for the company happens to be, right, I guess, there is like a better product, then I think, that like the role of like a growth person would be more driven by, like what are different growth experiments which we do, just inside of the actual product, right? And so that's like the first time user experience, to things like the onboarding flow, et cetera, et cetera. So I think, that in some ways, like the way to answer that question is based on what is the differentiator for the company, right? If the differentiator is, we've got a better product, then I think, you want to get a bit closer aligned to like the product and the product initiatives. And if the answer is, that like the differentiator happens to be the brand, right? Or it happens to be the content or things around like the actual, right? Like your kind of non-product activities, then I think, that like a marketing might be closer alignment. What you do want to get to, right? And I think, that like a few big companies are now starting to see this is that growth unto itself should be like a C-level role unto itself. And so, that like the Uber guys actually had like a chief growth officer, right? And I think what that meant is they looked at growth very holistically across things like product, marketing, and yeah, right? I think that like a bunch of different things. So I think that's high level, right? Like the way that I would answer that question.
Mm-hmm. Got it. Got it. So basically, it depends on the company to company. In certain cases, growth will be a very high level perspective, which will be cross functional. In certain companies, it will be a little more marketing oriented, a little more tech oriented, and so on. So product led growth versus marketing led growth versus a holistic growth. And accordingly, the growth PM would align differently. Right? Okay. There's one more question. Next is, okay. So for a typical B2B scenario versus B2C scenario, what's a D30? So if in B2C you're looking at D30, for a B2B scenario, is there a standard D60, D90, something that you look at?
Yeah, right. And so like the way that I would actually, yeah, right. I guess, there's also like another question that I skimmed through, right? And I think, that like the definition of the retention that you look at, yeah, right. I think that should be like an actual usage behavior, not somebody who opens or, has seen an email, right? And then clicks on it, right? And so I think, yeah, right. I guess, that like the D30 there, right? Like in that context is somebody who's actually using the app. And so if you're a company,
Right.
that's Grammarly, for example, right? And so if you're like an enterprise contract, like a bunch of companies, then it's about, would my consumer be using Grammarly or be using this tool? So
Right.
come D30. Right? And so I think, that like the percentages can change from like the one industry to the next or like the nature of the product to the next. But I think, that like the framework is the same, right? Which is, just like look at retention, not based on somebody who opens your app or website, but somebody who's actually transacting or consuming or using your service. And there's value exchange happening.
Got it. Um, so there is this question by Vinay, very interesting. In case of mobile apps, users keep on uninstalling and installing depending on the requirement, right? So in such case, how do we define retention?
Yeah, right. And so I think, that's a good question, right? And so I think, there's always going to be like a bunch of different things, that cause noise for you, right? And so like the noise can come, from, right, like the uninstalling, reinstalling. The noise can come, from like a bunch of, yeah, right? I think, they're going to just create new accounts to get free 1 month trials, right? And, just, actually keep doing that versus the consumer. So I think that at the end of the day, that is still a factor of the value that you provide to them, right? And so I think from that perspective, like if the app that you have is so sticky, that they have to have it, right? And it's not going to get deleted because they need like more space on their phone, etc. Then I think, that is like a strong value, right? And so I think, from like a mathematical perspective, there's tools that can help you control for that. And so if you go like the same, like, just like an IDFA, then it'll get controlled. And so like a tool that's like an apps file, will say, hang on, like here's a device ID, which I've seen in the past. And right, I guess like the attribution window that you have in that tool happens to be a month, right? And so if this uninstall, reinstall behavior happens, just within that month, it'll be caught. And to the point being, right, I think, there's tools that can help you control and like manage for the uninstalling reinstalling behavior. But at a high level, what you want to look at is, how do I keep my consumer from not uninstalling it? And like, frankly, how does my app become so important, that they're not going to delete it just because, that they need more space within their phone, etc.
Got it. Got it. So overarching, you would want to reduce the behavior of uninstalling, installing, and build enough value that people find reasons to not uninstall it. But on a very particular, like if you really have to fix this or you have to measure it, there are tools which will help you in identifying the uninstalling, installing behavior.
Yes.
Awesome. There's a very good question here. So by Brahmaya. Brahmaya has asked, what is the best deal when retention curve is going down? So retention is not so great. It's bad. I can do two things, right? Either I can retain more of these users or acquire new users, assuming that CAC is same in both the cases.
Right.
So what is better, improving the retention first or acquiring more users?
Yeah, so I think that just comes down to the things that you can actually show them, right? And so like the way that I would that, right? I think that I would actually yeah, right. I guess that like a framework that I could give you is let's say that you happen to be face to face with a consumer, and so if you go to them and say, what, so here's a product of mine, right, and here's product A, right, and then I think that if they say no, okay, I'm not interested, then that's fine, right? And so I think the right, I guess the right, and then you might go back to them the next day, right? And so whether that's an equivalent of a push notification or an email, and say, hey guys, here's my product again, right, and would you like it? Yeah, right. And yeah, right. And I guess that they say no. And so then what you might do is actually go back and then change your product, right? And so instead of, hey guys, here's product A, you would say, based on your feedback, I've now made some new product features or made some changes with my product. And so now it's a whole new product, right? And so yeah, right. I guess and so now let's call it product B, right? And then if you go back to the consumers with product B, and then if they say no, that's right. I think that's a sign, right? I think that you're better off moving to a new customer base. And so the way that I would answer this question is, that if you've got new product features which you have introduced, then it might be worth it for you to try the existing customer base.
Okay.
But at the same time, though, right? I think that if you are going to still have the same product set and the same product features, then I think you might be better off just to like not to bring in some more customers, but know that it's not a lasting strategy because you've got a leaky bucket, right? And so I think just for the sake of you getting more users for future product experiments, you can then get some users in. But just know, that like the ultimate signal that you're looking for is what is the retention, which I'm seeing either with the new or the older users.
Got it. So in a nutshell, if you have a leaky bucket, first fix the leaky bucket, get your retention right, improve your retention quality, etc. Because otherwise you will be spending a lot of money to get more users, but ultimately they will all simply they'll go away. Right.
Correct.
Right. Okay. So there are a couple of more questions. What should be user acquisition strategy when you are launching something which is already a hit among audience? So example is, let's say, what if someone replicates a popular game and publish it on Play Store, right? So in mobile gaming industry, it's pretty common, right? So there's, if there is one Flappy Bird which gets popular, then there's a lot of other Flappy Ship and Flappy Rhino and Flappy Dinosaur, everything will come up, right? So what would be what should be the user's acquisition strategy in that case?
Yeah, so I think that like the simplest thing is just take like the lessons learned, right? And so if that this game actually has got like a high amount of like the virality, then I think to just actually start there, right? And so an example is that like the apps that did quizzes, and so I guess that there was this app called QuizUp back in the day which did really well, right? And so for them, their invite and so strategy was a key driver. So I think that's what you do. That being said, right, I think they don't just assume that because they did it, it'll work for you, right? And so I think that what you should also have is that inherent cohort of users who would be yours, regardless of whether whether it's users who you have from like an existing product, which you're then going to funnel into a new one, or whether it's somebody who you think you can acquire fairly easily, just as like a captive one. And so I think, that whatever strategy that you go for, if you are replicating somebody, then I think, just take like a deep look at where they're getting customers from, and then try to think of which of your customers you can get would be truly yours and wouldn't switch off, to like the next spread, right, I guess, like the next kind of like a shiny thing that comes along. So that's the way that I would answer that question.
Understood. There's another very interesting question by Nitin, which is in your like in the very first this chart, you said, so what about scenarios where your initial launch pricing was off? Let's say you launched with a certain, wrong pricing, too high a price, for example, right? Was off and unable to achieve the desired 50% benchmark, for example. So how would you then start recalibrating and fixing the key indicators?
Sure. Yeah, right. And so I think, that is a great example, right? And so let's just, right, I guess, right. And so here, let's just flesh this out. And so let's say, that like the business happens to be, just like a subscription business, right? And so for use X rupees, which you have to pay, right? And so I think that if you find, that your pricing is off, then like the KPIs that's going to show up in. So the first place is going to be, right, like a D0 conversion, right? And so, if your pricing is off, then the conversion just will not happen, right? And so you will see your D0 conversion go down or based on if you brought your price down or brought it up, right? So that's one thing that you'll see. Then the next thing that's going to happen is, right, I guess, let's say that like the next billing event happens to be, like a month out or like a week out, right? And so whatever that is, that's where I think, that's going to show up in like the retention charts. And what you need to do is define retention, not based on somebody who's opened or like, done something in the app, but based on here's a user who's actually recurringly billed. Yeah, right. And so I think that becomes like the retention event that you model out within your KPI. Does that make sense?
Makes sense. Makes sense. Nitin, if you have any follow-up questions, feel free to type it down. Okay, there's one question by Jashank, which is, what can be the growth strategy for something like Uber or Airbnb, which is B2B2C, where you want to acquire Uber driver and end user simultaneously?
Yeah, so the way, these guys actually look at this is, right, I guess, they're actually like two different problems, right? And so they don't look at this, and this just looking at my friends who were there at Uber and Airbnb. So there's like an entirely different team that does, right, like your driver acquisition, and then there's an entire different team which does, that like the user acquisition, right? And so what they're doing, and I think, this is like a mental model that I will leave you with, is, yeah, right, I guess, that like the Uber guys look at their drivers also as, that like end consumers for them, right? And they also look at users and consumers. And so if you're like a marketplace type model, right, then, like the one thing I would suggest is map out who your customers are, right? So your drivers, your customers, your hosts, your customers, and then also look at your users as customers, right? And I think once you apply that lens or that framework, then you'll start to then flesh out, how do I acquire users on both ends?
Okay. Okay. So essentially look at both of them as customers and not as suppliers and customers. Is that what you're saying?
Yes, that's correct.
Very interesting. Okay. And why not look at them as suppliers? Like, what will go wrong if you look at them as building the supply on one side? Because that's the typical marketplace model, right? So look, you are building supply on one end, you are building demand on the other end.
Yeah, totally, right. And I think, that in some ways, right, I guess, that it gets back to like the notion of, what's the value that you provide, right? And so I think, that like the more that you look at them as here's a constituency which I have to serve versus them serving me, right? And so I think that like the more that you frame it like that, right, I think that'll give you, right, like both the ideas and the orientation within your organization to actually give them value that goes beyond, just like a check that you write at the end of, like a month or so. And so I think, that's the way that I would frame it, right? I think, that if you look at your other side of the marketplace as consumers, then I think there's a great signal for how you give, right, like value to them, which will make sure that your drivers come back. Or, right, I guess, then in the case of like the Airbnb, they're the hosts which come back, right? And I think that, like, just to illustrate that more, And so I guess, that like the Airbnb guys, right? I guess they're like a bunch of competitors, right? And so it wasn't just them. But the reason that they succeeded wasn't because of their growth strategy,
Okay.
from like the end consumer side, but it was more about what they did with the host, right? And so what Airbnb did is that, they would, and I guess, actually send out like a professional, I think just like a photographer to actually go into the host and like take high quality professional photos, give them, here's best practices, here's guides, how do you welcome, how do you answer a question, had a concierge for the host, right? And so I think those are examples of how Airbnb looked at hosts, as like an end consumer or like a constituency that they have to serve. So I think that's the right. And I think that's the reason, that they broke out of the mold, right? And so, well, just one example that I want to illustrate with, but that's what I mean by saying, like look at them as consumers, because now you're taking that extra mile to actually serve them.
Very interesting. Very interesting. That's a very, I mean, that's a very fresh take on what the established practices on marketplaces. That there's a supply, and the supply will automatically come if you have enough demand, and so build out the demand and supply will show up. But that doesn't happen, and you have to look at both of them as customers. If you look at them as customers, then you'll have a very different lens of acquiring them, retaining them, managing them, and so on and so forth. Very interesting. Okay, there's one follow-up question by Nitin, and that happens to be the last question as well for today's session, and that is, okay, Nitin has asked one more question. Okay, so Nitin's question was, in the previous example, when we were describing that if your pricing is off and you have not hit your 50% benchmark, in that case, can you explain the same thing for a non-subscription business, but still for a, let's say something else? It could be consumer, it could be enterprise. But a non-subscription business where the pricing is off, and now we have to figure out how to calibrate, because pricing is already out, the consumers are already aware of the pricing, and now I can't suddenly drop the price, I can't suddenly increase the price. So what do you think is suitable to do now?
Yeah, so I think I'm just trying to think through this, right? And I think, that if you could also just be like a little bit more on like the specific side, I think that might help. But the way that I would answer is, let's assume, right, I guess you're like an iTunes kind of like a business, right? And so it's like a transaction, or it happens to be something like Flipkart where it's a transaction,
Right.
If that like the pricing, which is on like a product A on the first day, could be 100 rupees, right? And so you could either change your pricing, or just have it the same, but now you've got the challenge that your retention metrics aren't that great. Have I understood that correctly?
Right.
So I think, that like the one thing you can do, right? And I think that's where, right, I guess, that like the digital platforms tend to be a little bit, more sophisticated, is, you could also, right, I guess, just do like an A/B testing, right? And say, here's a cohort of users that I'm going to show them this price, right? And if you have the ability to do that, then I think that's a good way for you to manage, right, I guess, right, like this challenge that you have, right? And just say that within these group of users, if I can do this or tweak this, then what is the impact on my D0 conversion, D1 retention, D7, D30 retention?
Okay.
And so I think that's like the one thing that I would say is just do an A/B test. And if you don't have the ability to do an A/B test, then I would say go a bit more on just like the qualitative side, right? And actually have user interviews, what have you, now to understand like what does new pricing make a difference when it comes to the retention, right? And if you need to do a trial or a separate.
Something went off at his end. Nishkam, are you there? Hello. Okay, something happened there. I don't know. So I think just to complete what Nishkam was talking about, essentially there are two things that you can do when things go wrong or things are as expected, which happens most of the time. Either you go quantitative or you go qualitative. You will start with quantitative because that is cheaper, faster, easier to do. So you'll go quantitative. That is, you look at analytics. You will try to do A/B test. If you can't do A/B test, perhaps you will do. Then you can jump to qualitative. So one other trick that I typically apply is, let's say, giving out some discounts or giving out some offers, and see, without actually reducing the sales price, if you give some discounts, some offers, something, does that lead to if the price was, let's say, $100, you gave a certain discount, and now the price is $75. For the same dollar spend, is the acquisition better or worse, right? And so keep on doing that iteratively, and you will end up with a certain amount that for which the people are responding better, and then you can recalibrate the product offering so that you can afford the new acquisition price. So you had certain costs built in at $100 price, which people are not willing to support. So you did some amount of offerings and some amount of work. You brought down the price to $50, $60. You figure out $50, $60. $50, $60 is a good price at which people are coming in very easily. So at that point of time, you'll recalibrate your cost structures so that your company can support the product at $50. And that's how you would do if you want to do completely quantitatively. The other route, obviously, is you can go qualitatively, where you can, instead of giving offers and discounts, if that is also not possible, do some focus groups, speak to some customers, try to find out why do they think that this price is too much, and so they would not like to pay. And then you will be able to recalibrate. Maybe you baked in too many features in that one single product, thinking of building a ubiquitous best possible product. Instead of that, break it down into 3-4 plans, and then try to get to your product. There's one more question from Nitin, but I think we are slightly off time. Feel free to post this on Slack channel, and we will answer it there. Nishkam would also join there, and that should help us in addressing the other questions which we missed out on. Nishkam, are you there?
Yeah, hi.
Okay,
so I think that I got disconnected for a little bit.
But I just covered your point of doing quantitative or qualitative research if your pricing is off, and then try to recalibrate your cost structures and your offering to support the new cost that you found that it is supporting your retention metrics.
Great. Yeah.
Okay. So this is where we pause. Thank you so much, Nishkam. This was a wonderful session. I hope this was useful for everyone.
Yeah, absolutely. Right. I think, there were like a lot of great questions. So I think that tells me, right, I guess, there's like a great group of people. And so I appreciate being invited.
Awesome.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Nishkam. Thank you everyone for showing up. In the next session, we're going to talk about, the next session is on Thursday, and we're going to cover the next natural progression, which is product market fit, the bane of everyone, how to get to product market fit. Okay. Awesome. Thank you so much. Have a good day.
Everyone.
Good evening. Good night. Bye-bye. Thank you, Nishkam, once again. Bye-bye.
Great. Thanks, guys.